I'll click record. Amazing. Awesome. So thank you all for joining. I want to thank everyone for taking time out of the afternoon today. Welcome to the Product Leader Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Nishith Patel. I will be your MC here today. Quick introduction to myself. I've been a product leader with experience across a various number of startups, focused mostly on B2B and B2C products throughout all of that. As I believe strongly, this is an exciting time to be a product leader, thanks to a growing community of product leaders that are leaning in to help each other out over the past couple of years. And this is a great example of that. And that is the exact connection that we hope to strengthen with this series, where we are in partnership with the Product Leader Summit, are making sure that we can bring the next generation of speakers and give them a platform to hone their craft, so we can bring useful content to you and facilitate small group conversations, because there's just so much to learn from each other, and that is our goal here. So today, our agenda will be to hear from two esteemed product leaders, Yue Zhao and Mamta, on how to build influence. Afterwards, we'll have a quick Q&A session where you can ask some questions around their exact topic here today on influence. We'll consistently provide you a method to provide NPS feedback, because that is how we actually create the content that we see here today. So we do take that very seriously. So please do share your thoughts. And then time permitting, we know that providing some networking opportunities is great. So we'll have some breakout rooms towards the end. So we aim to wrap this up so you have a couple minutes to breathe before your next meeting. So without further ado, let's kick off the panel with introduction. So Yue, please kick us off, followed by Mamta.
Hi, everyone. Super happy to be here. My name is Yue. I am currently a career coach and have been for the last year or so. I'm splitting my time between coaching as well as some advisory work. But prior to that, I was the Chief Product Officer and Chief Technology Officer at Fuzzy Pet Health, which is a digital health for pets platform. Prior to that, I was at Meta for 5 years, worked at Instagram on the consumer side, leading feed and profile, and then moved over to build a competitor for Zoom during COVID, and then spent a little bit of time in small business advertising. Prior to that, I was the first PM at Thumbtack, which is a local services marketplace. And I joined when there were about 12 people, left when there were about 600. So really amazing journey, and very lucky to have been through sort of a growth stage startup experience. Outside of that, I've done a bit of a stint in consulting. I've done a failed wine startup, a failed drop shipping business. So happy to chat about startup life to any of you guys interested, and super happy to be here. Over to you, Mamta.
Thank you, Yue. And I feel like I'll probably be one of the first to kind of pick your brains on startup life, because as I speak about my experience, you'll see it's predominantly like large corporations. So hi, everyone. I'm very, very excited to be here. It's a topic that, I've kind of wondered about for a long, long period of time. So very excited to share our thought, but also more importantly, to hear from all of you. I'm currently a senior director of product at Walmart e-commerce. I oversee their services portfolio. So think about pet grooming. You spoke about, pet health as another one, automotive services, wireless activations. So there's a huge business behind services and experiences around that Walmart offers. I'm really fortunate to be leading that team. Prior to Walmart, I've actually spent over a decade consulting, all of that focused on retail, e-commerce, digital transformation. But by virtue of having consulted, I feel like I got a chance to work with multiple different retailers, but also tech giants in the Bay Area, such as Google or Apple. So at Apple, for example, I worked on expanding their buy online, pickup in store capabilities to international markets. At Google, I worked on, master data management, and we know data is like the new currency. I also worked with Levi's, Gap, Constellation Brands, so several different retailers and retailers that were really looking to kind of pivot into digital transformation and drive new growth from those channels. So I've kind of spent over a decade of doing that as well prior to 5 years of Walmart. So that's a little bit about me. And personally, I'm an outdoor junkie, and I have a six-year-old dog who is my biggest stress buster. So whenever I don't know what to do, I kind of go to him. But really excited to be here and spend this time with everybody. Awesome. So team, the way we wanted to kind of really organize our time together, Yue and I have certain questions that we wanted to spend a little bit of time in a fireside channel format. So we'll kick us off. And to Nishit's point earlier, we do want to reserve like at least 50 minutes later in the session to be able to have a dialogue amongst ourselves, because like I mentioned earlier, this is a topic that's a bit gray and certainly can be looked at in various different formats. So would love to hear questions, thoughts, commentary from the rest of the folks here as well. So I'll get us started. And the first question that I think both Yue and I thought about would be crucial for us to spend a few minutes is, Yue, how do you think about building influence, and what are some of the core principles that drive, accomplishing that idea of building influence?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to, oh, the host has disabled my ability to share. I'd love to share a slide that
1 second,
summarizes,
I'll work on that.
All right, how I think about influence. But as we do that, I think when we talk about influence, we almost always start with this idea of, I want someone to do something for me. Like, I want to be able to influence someone. That's generally like the starting point. Perfect. Share screen. Here we go. Here we are. All right. So that's where we start. That's where I naturally start. It's like, I want to influence you, most likely because I want you to do something, or I want to convince you of something, or I think you should agree with me on something. It comes from a starting point of me to you. And what happens is often when we start trying to influence from that mindset, either the person doesn't respond, right? They don't really, or they're kind of interested. Maybe it gives you 30 minutes, but they're not super engaged. There's a lot of like non-starter conversations where you try to get them to be interested in something and they're just not engaging. I've also seen some cases where, at an extreme, people get frustrated. They start bullying the other person in some way to like more and more aggressively try to be like, hey, I really need you to help me with this, or I really want you to be, bought into my idea. And they're not. And I almost think that that's there's a mindset shift that needs to change here when it comes to how to think about influence. And, I didn't come up with this idea. Actually, the first time I heard about this was from Boz from Facebook, the CTO at Facebook. So the idea is you shift your mindset from, I want to influence you to do something, to I want to help you. Rather than like, I need you to do something for me, it's, I want to help you do something. And everybody loves help, right? If you go to somewhere, if I go to Mamta and I'm like, hey, I want to help you with something, they're going to be a lot more open to having a conversation, right? They're going to tell you, hey, these are my problems. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I'm working on. These are ideas that I have. These are perspectives that I have. And from there, you start building a relationship. You start building at least a conversation and a response, right? And it may take a bit longer, but oftentimes it actually doesn't because of the non-response and the non-starter in the other scenario. It may feel like you're getting a little bit more roundabout, you're going out of your way. But most often it's actually the shorter path. It's, hey, how can I help you? Let me help you with something. Let me do something for you. Let me help you solve a problem, and then let's collaborate. If I do something for you, you're going to be a lot more open to then doing something for me. Mm-hmm. And it's okay if that comes as a second thing or a third thing, because now we're collaborating. And so I think that first and foremost is that mindset shift from, hey, I want to influence you, to like, how do we build a relationship? How do I like connect with you? How do I really help you first before I ask you to help me with something? And I think with that, I think this maybe gets into, I'd love Mamta to also share some of her conversation. How do you get someone to want your help? Right? Like, so it becomes, how do I get someone to want my help? Well, it's not these green bubbles at the bottom. It's about expertise and knowledge, right? Like, what do you know? It's about how accessible are you as a person, someone that I can like feel comfortable talking to, feel like I can reach out to you. And then it's about treating people with kindness, which actually kindness sometimes means saying no if you're busy, and saying like, hey, this is what I can help with. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. And being just very almost direct and upfront on this is who I am. These are my, this is my expertise. This is my amount of time, and treating people with care, like how you would want to be treated. So it's a quick overview of my sort of framework for influence, and I'll pass it back to Mamta for her to share some of her thoughts around her frameworks for influence.
Yeah, thank you, Yue. And I'll share my screen as well. But what I'd probably say is, as I looked at the framework that, became apparent to me, and then of course, tied it back to what Yue said, principally what you will see in the framework here is very similar across, how I looked at it and how Yue looked at it. Just the framing of, the idea of influence was probably just a different starting point. So when I think about influence, I see it actually as a flywheel. And flywheel across two different dimensions, and influence basically sits in the center for when that flywheel starts to move. So what are the components or legs of this flywheel? First is building relationships, right? So really thinking about not necessarily, hey, I want this, and to Yui's points earlier, which is, hey, I want to influence you. That's not the great starting point. It's really like saying, how do I help someone so that when I need their help, they will be equally reciprocative, but also, they would really know who I am to be able to help me in an appropriate way, right? So first leg of the stool is really building strong relationships. And I'll come to tips that I have learned in my own career or experience for what works and doesn't work. And you'll see the tie back to Yui's talk or her perspective a few minutes back as well. When we start building strong relationship, it really drives our credibility, right? And that's kind of the other leg of the flywheel, which is when we build credibility, which again, I have a couple of tips here to share with everybody. By doing the right actions, when we build credibility, that further drives relationships. So I kind of see this as a flywheel, like one feeds into the other. And over a period of time, and that's a critical component I have learned, is influence is not built in one day. It is not something that you accomplish or turn on as a 0 to 1 state. It is something that takes time, it takes energy, it takes diligence, it takes focus, and it is time investment, after which influence starts to become very, very apparent. So if I dig a little bit deeper into tips for building relationships as well as building credibility and how to get that flywheel to start moving, in terms of building relationships, I have found 3 critical things that have helped me, particularly from my experience. First is truly seeking to understand. When there is a situation, when there is a conflict, when there is something that is not working as it should be or as we envision for our own selves, first step is really seek to understand. So instead of saying something like, hey, I don't think this is working, really saying, I'm seeing this as a gap. Here is my perspective. What do you think is happening or not happening? And really taking the time and really kind of saying, help me understand and help me see your perspective of what you are seeing versus what I'm seeing, and how do we actually make this as a win-win. So investing the time to truly seek other person's perspective, I have seen has been one of the greatest unlock for me. The second one is having the hard conversations. Often people think that great relationships are built when everything is hunky-dory. Actually, what I've found is the opposite, which is when there's something that's not working and you actually seek to understand and you actually take the steps to make it work, right? And you kind of deliver the hard conversations with honesty and truthfulness, but the intent of solving the core problem at hand. That is where I have found the biggest unlock in terms of the relationship. Because you can imagine even in our own personal lives, we fight with our siblings, with our parents, and it's really those difficult situations that bring us together and bring us together in a way that is sort of unbreakable for the long term. Same principle applies even at workplace. Like when there is a difficult situation or you're solving for complex problems together with the same goal in mind, that's where I've seen, strong relationships being built. And the third one is take the first step, which is very similar to what you were just talking about. You be the first one to go help someone. And believe it or not, they will reciprocate over a period of time with 2x or 5x in return, right? But really the key in building that long-term relationship is you take the first step to go above and beyond in doing something that matters to them and is kind of serving their goals. That's where sort of like the strong long-term relationships and quality of relationship like truly start to unlock. So these are sort of like the 3 tips that I have found in terms of building the relationships. And over a period of time, by repeating these tips and tricks and actions, it starts to build your credibility. So now let's come to building your credibility and what are sort of the 3 tips that I have learned from my experience that has really helped like me. And of course, I'm continuing to iterate on this. So maybe 5 years from now, it'll be slightly different, like a revised version of this. So in terms of building credibility, the 3 things that I have really found that has helped me learn what helps is first is operate with honesty. And this does tie back to a little bit of what I mentioned earlier, which is have the hard conversation. When something is not working, it is actually much, much more effective to say the truth and say what is or is not working, but then really saying it with the intent of solving the problem that might be at hand. That's sort of the crux versus finger pointing or saying that, you are not doing this right, but raising a challenge with honesty, saying, hey, this is why I really want to have this conversation. We need to solve this problem together. Here are some of my ideas, but what are your ideas for how might we solve it? And doing that with honesty and intent of solving the core problem at hand or like driving the right outcomes, I have seen is super crucial for building credibility. Second is do what you say and say what you do. This is a hard one because oftentimes, we think we can do a lot more than what we are actually able to do. And that's kind of where your credibility starts to erode. So over a period of time, I've learned to actually say more no's than than more yeses, very similar to Yui's point earlier, like, being accessible or being, truly available also means that say that you can or cannot do it. And that's totally okay because, you're being respectful to somebody else's time by saying you will do something, but not doing it, right? That can be very frustrating. And then lastly, own your actions, right? Like when there is a mistake made on your part, like the best thing one can do is say, we missed this, this was on us. We should have seen this come. And then really own your actions in the way that, lead with articulating what you would do to fix it and prevent it from happening in the future and actually coming through on those promises for the actions you have promised to course correct. I've seen has been a crucial element of building credibility. So I feel like these 3 tips and sort of like continuing to invest on credibility and relationship, and over a period of time, you'll start to see that your network really wants to seek your inputs and advice, come about as something that does work. So very similar principles to, I think, what Yue was mentioning earlier. But with that, I will transition us into the second part of our conversation. Yue, why do you think it is important to build influence, especially in the professional setting? So I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I think influence underlies everything that we do, right? So I came up through product. Product is very much an influence-based role, and influence without authority kind of underlies the role in of itself. But even in roles where there is formal authority, I think being able to influence beyond your direct scope is critical for growing in an organization or you don't want to grow sort of upwards, like laterally or moving on to projects that are more exciting for you, that are better fit for, whatever goals that you have at the moment. At the end of the day, to me, influence does 2 things. One is helps you get your job done faster, right? Whatever your job is, whatever you need to get done, helps you get it done faster. And then 2, helps you get heard in the organization for the ideas that you have. I think maybe there's many of the folks on the call like me where I have a lot of ideas. Like I think certain things should be happen certain ways and I get frustrated when they don't. And I think, when you want to make bigger changes, and again, what your formal authority may allow in an organization, that all comes down to influence, whether it's about getting an idea heard or, starting something new. And I think it's important to be able to have influence on all aspects of your role and your career, since we spend so much of our time in our jobs.
Yeah, that is so well said, Yue. Particularly, I think what you mentioned, which is when we want to drive big change, right? Like you mentioned, influence is a critical component of, like unlocking and making that change. And as I thought about, or as I heard you say that, the aspect that struck me in why influence is critical comes down to the bare bones of like the human psychology, right? Like big change cannot happen if there isn't the right masses behind it actually driving that change. And if we double click on that further, how do we actually get like masses to get behind something? It's really through helping them see a perspective that they may or may not be seeing up front. And then how do you get them to see something that you might be seeing? That's where kind of like, the power of influence comes into play, right? So I almost see this as like as a cascading effect of change requires many people behind it. To get many people behind it, you really need to get them to see a point of view that they may or may not be seeing it because they could be busy, their context might be different. And how do you get them to see that? That's where influence comes into play. So if you have the right influence in terms of like relationships and credibility, you can take forward to those sets of people an idea that they otherwise may not spend the time thinking about or even listening to. And that's where sort of like the core of influence and the power of why influence is critical. And what I also learned, like in professional settings, as you keep growing more and more in the seniority and level of responsibilities, there isn't anything like, directing anybody. So Indra Nui speaks about this in her book. She says, I'm the CEO of the company, but all I do is influence and get like, my team and partners to really see my vision so that they can help me execute on it. So even the CEO of the companies feel like they have to operate with influence, even though, teams report into them. And so it's become really apparent to me that the real unlock is influence without authority rather than directness or kind of like really telling people to do something. With that, I think let's pivot into sort of like the other flavor of influence. Yue, what do you think people get wrong about influence?
I think it goes to the core. I mean, the first goes to the core of what I started with, right? Which is often when we think about influence, we think, how do I get you to buy into my idea? How do I get you to be on my side? How do I get you to do something I would like you to do? And I think that's the wrong starting point, right? The mindset needs to be shifted on its head, and it's more, how do I help you get something done? Because the way for me to influence you is actually to help you get something done. And that thing happens to be in the same path or same direction, or, along the path of where I would like to go as well. Or, playing into the reciprocal, sense of like, I help you with something, you help me with something. And so really turning that mindset on its head, and having the other starting point prevents you from going down a path of frustration and bullying, as I've seen in some startups and cultures where you're really aggressively trying to push your agenda, and the more aggressively you push it, the less likely it's actually going to be taken up by the rest of the group. And I think the second misconception is that sometimes people think influence is the thing that you can work on absent of doing great work. They're like, oh, influence is like another skill set. And in a way, yes, it is. But in very much, it relies on your reputation. You talk about credibility, right? It relies on your expertise. Like if you're, I'm a product leader, so if you're a good product manager, you're having a ton of impact on the company, you're delivering win after win, you're going to have influence. Like when you talk and when you suggest something and when you give a recommendation, other people are going to listen. If you're just a sort of average PM, mostly meeting your goals, not really doing anything spectacular, when you recommend something, people are not going to listen as much. So the very basis of influence actually does come from doing great work. So they're not different things. You can't and so yes, there are cultures where it's more about relationships. It's a bit quote unquote bro-y. It's about who you know. But I think for the most part, particularly in Silicon Valley and some of the, amazing companies, like it's very much about what the work speaks for itself. And then on top of that, you can accelerate and sort of boost your influence by doing certain things, like thinking about how you can help somebody, thinking about how you can reach out, thinking about how you can make those connections. But that underlying foundation of great work and amazing work that speaks for itself, I think has to be there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I couldn't agree more with you. I think one other thing I'd probably add to everything you mentioned, at least this was my self-realization. When I was much younger in my career, I used to think about like, influence as something like a 0 or a 1 state. And I used to think that it could be tied to, um, you know, more visible factors like titles, etc. What I'm starting to realize, or I started to like learn, and in the past few years of my experiences, very similar to what you said, it's hard work which takes time, right? Like it's not something that you build overnight. It's something that does require the work, very similar to what you mentioned. That's been sort of like my learning, that it's something that warrants the hard work, and that sort of non-negotiable, like in terms of building your credibility. So it's something very similar to exercising, right? Like in wellness, like if people think that hacky, just simple diet, like one-time things can help you for building a long-term wellness and health, like very similar to that. Like influence is not something that you can hack it in like just one day. It requires consistent, persistent, over a period of time investment in order for one to truly have influence in whatever capacity that they want. So with that, perhaps switching into like a different aspect of influence, Yue, what are your thoughts about how does like influence differ, or does it differ from organizations to organizations? I'm sure all of us are representing many different companies, like both in our current and past experiences. I'm sure there are different elements of like how to think about that. So any thoughts around, is influence similar or different across different organizations, and any tips and strategies for the team to think about like molding their influence as they go from one organization to another in their professional career?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think of it's as similar as all humans are similar, and it's as different as all humans are different. So it's both. I think when you go from larger organizations like a Meta of the world to a small organization, which Thumbtack was told people when I joined, the speed at which you can influence the direction of an organization is very different, right? Just based on the number of people that you have to talk to and touch. And I think what people care about differs. Like Instagram, for example, was very design driven. Thumbtack was very data driven. There are places that are very founder driven, and there are places that are very like bottom up. And so I think whenever you step into a new organization, it's really important to understand not just how influence works, but basically how people dynamics work, right? Like what are the functions that drive the decisions? Why? Who are the people that are the more influential folks in the organization? Why? What do people really care about here? What's gonna, what do they want help with, and what's going to change the narrative in the past? And how does it work? And I think those are things that no matter where you go, you'll get different answers to, but the underlying question that you're asking is the same. It's basically like, how do these people work together? What's the culture? And what are the similarities that they care about and the bonds that they share? Because at the end of the day, I think similar to what you were talking about in terms of like a shared vision, like it's about telling a story together. I always imagine when I walk into like a role or a company as we're on a journey together. We're creating a story together. What's a story that we all want to create? And how do we have conviction that this is the direction or story that we want to create together? And if you think about it from that perspective, I think you can begin to care more about, okay, what's the underlying motivation, right? And what's going to give you that extra amount of influence. And, funny story, when I first went from a startup, Thumbtack, to Meta, I was kind of shocked at how many people cared about performance reviews. Because it was not a thing that mattered really at a startup, right? Versus you go to Meta and you're like, okay, there are people here who care a lot about how this shows up on their performance review. So you start learning like, hey, these are the things that matter, versus at a startup, it's about the mission, right? And it's about where we're going and the people that we're serving and, the effect that it has on those people. And so, I think influence is different, but again, at the end of the day, it's what brings people together and what's the story that you're telling together.
So well articulated, Yue. I think what you just mentioned ties back to your point at the beginning, which is start from them, not from yourself. Like your starting point has to be them. So well said. Very similar experiences when I worked at Google versus Apple versus Gap. What mattered to them was very different. And starting with that position and then helping them see a different perspective always was better resonated. So I couldn't agree more with your point around it's same, but it's different in the sense that, just how they look at it or the starting point of how they look at it may just differ, but the principles don't necessarily change. Perhaps our last question, and then we'll kind of open it up for discussions and Q&A as well. Yue, how do you think influence differs from authority or leadership?
Yeah, I think of influence as informal authority and authority as formal authority. So, with your title, with reporting structures, with organization structures, you have formal authority. And then influence is really the informal authority. And every company is on a spectrum of how important formal authority, org structures, processes, decision-making processes are versus informal authority, which is nobody actually follows the actual process. Everybody just goes around it. And it's like a very informal environment. And I almost always think of influence as leadership as kind of the same thing, where leadership is kind of influence plus a direction or a vision. And again, going back to that story that we tell together, leadership is helping people see like, okay, where are we trying to all get to? How do we want to get there? And the process of telling that story and working on that story and collaborating is really influence.
That's awesome. Yeah, nothing more that I can add to that, but so well articulated, especially like your point around leadership is influence plus like direction or sort of like the vision, right? So well articulated, Yue.
Thank you.
With that, we will take maybe like about 30 seconds to a minute where we wanted to present a call to action to this group, and then we'll switch into our Q&A session. So really our call to action was take maybe 30 seconds to a minute. Think about a challenge that you're experiencing in your current role, whether that is, professional or even personal. By the way, influence is also like very applicable in personal lives. I don't know if you all feel that, but absolutely applicable from my experience at least. So take maybe 30 seconds to a minute to think about a challenge you're experiencing in your current role. Based on the discussion we have just had, perhaps, list down 3 to 5 actions that you will take to drive influence in that situation in a direction that will be truly win-win for yourself and for the other party involved. And I underscore the fact win-win, because if it is not a win-win, you will never accomplish influence. And it does go back to our earlier point, right? To Yui's point of start with them, not yourself, or really build that relationship and credibility. And that only does occur if it's a win-win solution. So maybe take 30 seconds to a minute. It's 9:38. Perhaps, at 9:39, we'll open it up for discussions. Also feel free to bring that challenge that you may be experiencing to this group for the purposes of our Q&A or discussions as well. So maybe uncomfortable 30 seconds to a minute, but yeah, we'll allow you all to do some thinking. Awesome. I hope that was sufficient time. Or I'm sure for many folks in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, who are used to always go, 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 that was uncomfortable silence. But we all need it. So Getting comfortable with uncomfortable is sort of like the new mantra. So with that, friends, let's open it up for questions or even discussion points that you all may have to add to this conversation, because equally interested to learn from you all as well.
Thank you, Mamta and Yue. That was very valuable and very engaging. We do have one question in the chat from Denny Beck, who wants to hear examples from both of you when you failed at influence. And now looking back, what is it that you got wrong in that instance?
Really great question. Maybe I'll start with an example. So about a couple of years back, perhaps 2 years back, I was working on product transformation for an area with very senior executives, like essentially as C-suite as you can imagine for a large corporation. And we were working on certain experience optimizations where the results indicated that the customer's expectation is different from some of our executives' direction. And in terms of working to communicate that there were multiple layers before it would reach the right level of executive team that had given us the direction. So in terms of like my failure in that immediate instance was I communicated the need for, with specificity, communicating further up even, that the results and data points that we are seeing is actually not indicating that the direction that we had gotten from our very senior leaders is working, right? So principal direction was right, but the specificity of how the experience was designed was not working. So we needed to iterate on experience towards that principal direction that we needed to do. So my ask was for my immediate leaders to go communicate even further up, and that didn't quite happen. So I assumed my influence ended at the level of like just communicating immediate up, but I feel like in retrospection, influence would be like really informing or articulating why it must even go further up, because the direction had come immediately from very senior executives. So obviously that didn't go really well. We got very tough feedback from very senior executives at the company that I was working on. But what I would say was my biggest learning was influence again is not a point in time, right? When we got that tough feedback and really, really difficult feedback, and some days in one-on-ones, I'm happy to share more specifics there. What we really landed up doing as a team, which actually contained or continued our influence in the long term, was we accepted, and going back to own your mistakes, we said we got it wrong. Doesn't matter if it is an individual, myself, or another individual, didn't matter. I think the approach we took as a team was, when we got that tough feedback, we said we as a team got it wrong. We should have communicated with specificity and in time to the right leaders. We are going to go course correct it, and we are going to pivot the ship in a direction that will actually drive results. And we hyper focused in doing what we said we will do and promising what we can do. And for about 6 to 9 months, we put our heads down, changed the growth trajectory, communicated effectively and timely, so much so that CEO of the company about 6 to 9 months later came back to our team with one-on-one, sort of articulation of his appreciation for the team and how we kind of took feedback in our stride. So I would say that the moment in terms of the influence was certainly a bit of a failure, but going back to that learning of influence is not a point in time, and really kind of owning your mistakes is a critical component of driving credibility. We took that into our stride and we acted on that promise of, we got your feedback, this is how we're going to solve it going forward, and this is how we're going to communicate. Really worked wonders in our favor over a period of time. So the entire team now is known very well by the C-suite of the company, and it purely goes back to that mindset that we as a team took in that instance. So I hope that's a helpful reference, Danny, to your question. But Yue, I'll let you chime in as well.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Well, I fail to influence my 4-year-old all the time. And I have yet to find a good strategy. So I'm still working on that. Ideas welcome. But on the professional side, I was thinking about this a little bit. I think funny enough, I can think of more failure scenarios than successful scenarios sometimes, but there's a couple of buckets. One is when the power dynamics just aren't there, where, the people that I need to influence or convince of a different perspective has a lot more power than I do. And I'm, to Mamta's example, like my influence just doesn't extend that far yet. And it takes time to build up, and I'm not quite there. And then misjudging that, I think, is one mistake that I've made in the past. One example, again, as I transitioned from Thumbtack, where I had been at for 5 years, into Instagram. In my second month at Instagram, I tried to convince Kevin Systrom to do something. He was like, no. And I was like, cool. Kind of misjudged that one in terms of, the amount of preparation, the amount of people I had to get bought in, and how he was good, learning more about his style and what he cared about, and then the level of design specificity that I needed to get done. So I think that's one example. I think another time is where really my ego got in the way, where I felt like, with a lot of pride, that I had convinced myself, based on the data and the research and my conversations, that this was definitely the right way. And I wasn't open, even though I said I was open, but I really wasn't open-minded to other options and other ways of getting things done as much as I should have been. And, it wasn't until there was almost too much rallying, of people on my team or others to be like, hey, Yue, actually, no, like, consider this other thing, and like truly consider it. And, I wasn't honest with myself about how open I was being to there being other options. And then the third related to that is actually influence goes the other way, right? So as a chief product officer, right, you have a lot of power, and you actually have to be very conscious of that power, because I often underestimate how seriously people take suggestions that I make, or things that I might say on an offhand, or taking my excitement about something as, oh, this is the direction we should go in because Yue is excited about it. So influence actually does very much go the other direction. And sometimes the mistakes you make is actually the other way of, you didn't want to influence the team as strongly as you did. You wanted them to come up with a different direction, but you may have, stated something with too much authority or too much excitement.
No,
But the 4-year-old still is the hardest
yeah.
one. So
I have a 2-year-old, and I know exactly what you mean, Yue. I have not figured that one out. Nishit, we have 8 minutes left, and we have a few more questions. Do we want to do breakouts too, or do we continue with questions?
Let's do one question and then give the folks about 10 minutes for breakouts.
All right. So I am going to choose Dave Martin's question because I love that question, and something I also don't know how to differentiate. So his question is, how do you recognize the difference between influence and negotiation? Like, are they two different things? Do you treat them differently? What a great question, Dave. Thank you for asking.
Yue,
I'll
would you?
share my, yeah, sure. I'll share my thought on that. It depends. Sorry, I know everybody hates that answer. So starting with actually negotiation, I think of negotiation as you're on two different sides of something, whatever it is, right? And you're negotiating as in you're trying to figure out, like, how can we get closer together and meet somewhere on wherever that invisible line is. And so you're essentially, best negotiate tactic is put everything on the table and then try to grow the pie, right? And try to see if there are other things that you can draw in so that you can meet somewhere and have the right set of trade-offs. Negotiations tend to be relatively short-term. As Mamta was mentioning, right, influence takes time, and it's over a very long horizon, and it's something much more subtle, I think, and not very easily quantified, versus the negotiations in my mind are much more like, here's 5 things I want, here's 5 things you want, how do we put those together, and how do we, like, make those work? Versus influence almost feels like a input into the negotiation, but it's also drawn out it's very much about like the type of relationship that you have, drawn out over a long period of time. And negotiations tend to be like very short term about like, what do you get? What do I get? How do we get, how do we work together? And how do we reach a particular agreement?
Yeah, well said, Yue. I think like the thought in my head, which you so well articulated, was like influence is an input into negotiation, and then the other difference being influences over a time horizon rather than negotiation can be point in time. And of course, there can be many negotiation as you build influence, even with the same set of parties. But like in negotiation is slightly a smaller time horizon, point in time for a very specific outcome. And a tool that typically I've seen work for negotiation is options and pros and cons from all parties involved's vantage point, right? Like, so like being truthful to that fact. So it can be a little bit more tactical, like short-term action oriented versus influences long horizon. It requires, multiple back and forths between different parties involved. Yeah.
Yeah, and sounds like you will have to negotiate fairly with somebody to be able to build that credibility and relationship over time, right? And tactfully.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mamta. Thank you, Yue. I know we have some questions left. I have written them down. We will try our best to get them answered offline. I'll share them with you, Yue and Mamta. So now let's do, first of all, a huge thank you to both of you. Nishit, anything you want to add before we go into breakouts?
Just thank you so much. Please go in the breakouts, and then at the top of the hour it'll break. We won't come back. So thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you to everyone for engaging with some amazing questions here.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us and asking really engaging questions.
Thank you for having us.
All right, I'm going to create, and please know, as Nishit mentioned, we are not going to be coming back to this room. So around 10 a.m. PST, the Zoom would end. All right, there we go.